At the most extravagant wedding of the year, beneath glittering chandeliers and the weight of old money, the unthinkable happened. A moment meant for love and celebration turned into something else entirely, something no one saw coming. The bride stood frozen, the guests held their breath, and in that instant, everything changed. What really happened at the Randolph estate that night? And how did one decision alter the fate of an entire legacy? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth. Subscribe now and hit the like button if you love gripping stories with unexpected twists. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Jessica Morris stood before the full-length mirror in the opulent bridal suite of the Randolph estate, her reflection flawless yet unfamiliar. Her wedding gown, a breathtaking creation of ivory satin and intricate beading, clung to her frame like a carefully constructed facade. The weight of the fabric was nothing compared to the unspoken truths pressing down on her. This was not a day of love, nor was it the culmination of a fairy tale romance. This was a merger, a transaction sealed with vows and a contract masked as a marriage. Her parents had ensured the deal was favorable. Richard and Evelyn Morris had built their empire from the ground up, establishing themselves as one of the wealthiest and most influential families in modern business. Their daughter's marriage to Lucas Randolph was meant to secure their entry into the aristocracy of old money, where legacy held more weight than earnings. The Randolphs, once an unshakable dynasty, had been struggling for years, their wealth thinning despite their outward display of prosperity. Lucas, the golden heir, was their best chance at salvation, and Jessica was the key to his survival. Jessica had convinced herself she could handle it. She was not a romantic. She was a strategist. She had built her own success in corporate negotiations, understood the language of power, and had long accepted that in their world, love was an afterthought. But, standing here now, moments away from stepping into a life dictated by someone else's ambitions, she felt the first stirrings of doubt. The whispers in the back of her mind, the ones she had ignored for months, grew louder. She inhaled deeply, exhaling just as the knock came at the door. Evelyn entered first, her gown nearly as elaborate as Jessica's, her presence commanding yet effortless. She approached her daughter, eyes scanning her appearance with the critical precision of someone accustomed to perfection. A satisfied nod followed. "You look stunning," she murmured, adjusting a single stray curl near Jessica's temple. "Everything is exactly as planned." Jessica forced a smile. Richard Morris followed, his sharp gaze assessing her with the quiet intensity of a man who had spent his life ensuring that every move was calculated. He placed a firm hand on her shoulder, the weight of it grounding. "Are you ready?" Jessica's fingers curled slightly, but she nodded. She had no choice. Moments later, she descended the grand staircase of the Randolph estate, every pair of eyes in the room turning toward her. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the marble floors, the towering columns, and the portraits of long-gone ancestors who had built this legacy. This was a kingdom, one in need of saving, and she was the sacrifice that would ensure its survival. Lucas stood at the altar, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He was handsome in the way men of privilege often were, effortlessly refined, well-groomed, and polished in every movement. He took her hand as she reached him, but his grip was impersonal, firm yet devoid of warmth. The ceremony passed in a blur. Vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, rehearsed lines spoken in perfect harmony. The applause that followed felt distant, muffled beneath the realization that she was no longer Jessica Morris. She was now Mrs. Jessica Randolph, the perfect piece in a carefully orchestrated game. The reception unfolded in the estate's sprawling gardens beneath a canopy of lights. Champagne flowed, laughter echoed, and the illusion remained intact. Jessica played her role flawlessly, her smile never faltering as she accepted congratulations from dignitaries, CEOs, and socialites. But beneath the surface, she felt a distance growing. Lucas thrived in this environment, slipping into conversations about politics, investments, and power with effortless charm. He had not looked at her since their staged kiss at the altar. He was performing, and so was she. It was near the fountain, away from the crowd, that she overheard them. Two men, business associates of the Randolph family, speaking in hushed tones over whiskey. "Smart move on his part," one said, swirling his glass. "Marrying into the Morris empire will keep the Randolph name alive for another generation." The other chuckled. "He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband, but he's getting an investment." Jessica's grip on her champagne flute tightened. Her gaze found Lucas across the reception, laughing at something an old flame had said, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. Perhaps she had always known the truth. This wasn't a marriage, it was a transaction, and she was the asset. For years, she had prided herself on being in control, but standing here, realizing that she had allowed herself to be outmaneuvered, she understood the truth. She had never been in control at all. Not yet, but that was about to change. The grandeur of the Randolph estate masked the fractures within. Beneath the opulence of the ballroom, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the effortless conversations of the elite, Jessica felt the weight of her new reality settle over her like a suffocating veil. The reception was a flawless display of wealth and tradition, every detail curated to perfection. Yet, the moment Lucas had slid that ring onto her finger, she had felt it, the silent shift in power. Lucas had not spoken to her directly since their brief exchange at the altar. His attention belonged to his guests, to his circle of old money associates who had watched this union unfold with interest. He was charming, slipping into conversations with the ease of someone who had been raised to command a room. His presence was magnetic, his tone controlled, his laughter measured. And yet there was something missing, a sincerity, an acknowledgement of her place at his side. Jessica stood near the edge of the ballroom, the stem of her champagne flute cool against her fingers. Across the room, Lucas was engaged in conversation with a group of men, his expression shifting between amusement and calculation. He was thriving here, in his element, playing the role of the golden heir who had secured a future for his crumbling dynasty. She was merely an extension of his triumph, an acquisition that he had successfully claimed. Her mother approached her then, poised and regal in an elegant midnight blue gown. Evelyn Morris had spent her life mastering the art of power and influence, and tonight was no exception. She placed a delicate hand on Jessica's arm, her voice smooth as silk. "Smile, dear," Evelyn murmured, her gaze sweeping the room. "People are watching." Jessica forced the corners of her lips upward, though the smile felt foreign. "You should mingle more," her mother continued. "There are important people here tonight." Jessica's fingers curled around her glass. "Important to whom?" Evelyn's eyes flicked toward Lucas, who raised his glass in a silent toast, his expression unreadable. Jessica returned the gesture mechanically, though her stomach twisted at the realization that this was all she could expect from him now. A series of rehearsed gestures, a partnership in name only. Across the room, her father, Richard Morris, was engaged in a quiet conversation with Lucas. Jessica watched as Lucas nodded politely, his grip tightening slightly around his glass. The exchange was brief, but she recognized the tension in her husband's shoulders. Lucas had always been wary of her father, though he would never admit it. Perhaps it was because Richard was a self-made man, someone who had built his empire from nothing, while Lucas had inherited a name that meant less with each passing year. Or perhaps it was because Richard saw through him. Jessica's younger brother, Malcolm, had never been one to hide his opinions, and his feelings about Lucas had been evident from the start. When their paths crossed near the bar, his tone carried the edge of a warning. "You're an interesting man, Randolph," Malcolm said, swirling his drink. "Not the type I pictured my sister with." Lucas smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "And what type did you picture?" Malcolm chuckled. "Someone who knows what he's getting into." Jessica saw it, the barely perceptible clench of Lucas's jaw, the subtle tightening of his grip on his drink. He did not like being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. With a calculated laugh, he excused himself from the conversation, but the tension lingered. Jessica followed his movements as he walked away, noting the way he downed half his drink in a single swallow before handing off the empty glass to a passing waiter. He was losing control. She had seen glimpses of it before, the moments when his charm faltered, when his frustration sharpened his words, when his grip tightened just a fraction too much. But tonight, the cracks in his composure were widening. The evening dragged on, a carefully orchestrated display of tradition and spectacle. Jessica played her part, smiling for the cameras, answering polite but prying questions about their honeymoon, about their shared future. She spoke of plans that she knew were nothing more than a script while Lucas continued his performance, pretending to be the devoted husband. She had resigned herself to the charade, until she overheard him speaking to his friends. It was an accident. She had been passing by, moving through the crowd, when his voice cut through the air. "Smartest move I've ever made," Lucas was saying, his tone just smug enough to send a chill down her spine. His friends laughed. "You make it sound like a business deal," one of them joked. Lucas shrugged. "That's what marriage is, isn't it?" Jessica stopped breathing. She turned her head just slightly, just enough to see him, to see the way he leaned against the bar, relaxed, self-assured, speaking about her as if she were nothing more than a calculated decision. Her stomach turned. She had always known, hadn't she? Deep down, she had known. But hearing it like this, spoken so carelessly, so confidently, shattered any illusions she might have held on to. She wasn't a partner to him, she was a means to an end. And in that moment, something inside her hardened. She was not a woman who allowed herself to be used. If Lucas thought this was his victory, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The air inside the Randolph estate was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, rare wines, and the underlying tension that had settled between Jessica and Lucas. The night carried on with the smooth elegance expected of an event of this scale. Soft music, practiced laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses as toasts were made in their honor. But for Jessica, the carefully curated illusion had begun to crumble. She had spent the last hour moving through the reception, acknowledging guests, nodding at compliments, answering polite but prying questions about their plans as newlyweds. It was all mechanical now. The warmth she had once forced into her expressions had been drained, leaving only the remnants of a practiced performance. Her husband had not spoken to her directly since their staged greeting at the entrance. Not once. She had watched him work the room, his expression perfectly set, his voice carrying just the right mix of charm and intellect. But she had also seen the way he reacted whenever her name was mentioned in conversations. He wasn't controlling a slight downturn of his lips, a flicker of something behind his gaze. She was beginning to understand something fundamental about Lucas. He had never expected to share the spotlight. As the reception wore on, that understanding became more painfully clear. She found herself seated at the head table, surrounded by key members of both families as the conversation took an inevitable turn toward the topic of finances. Jessica had anticipated this. The Morris name was synonymous with wealth, new wealth, but wealth nonetheless. Her family had built their empire from the ground up, securing dominance in both the technology and art worlds. The Randolphs, on the other hand, were a name that once commanded power, now clinging desperately to its former prestige, and Lucas, in his mind, had made the smartest move possible. He had married into the future. But what he had not anticipated was that the Morris family did not give freely. My wife and I were discussing earlier how beautifully this evening came together, one of Lucas's uncles was saying, swirling his drink. A grand affair. I imagine it cost a small fortune to orchestrate something of this scale. Jessica felt it before she saw it. The slight stiffening in Lucas's shoulders, the tension in the air around him. She knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting for someone, preferably her father, to confirm what he had always assumed, that the Morris family had footed the bill for this spectacle, that this night was yet another generous contribution from his wife's bottomless resources. Richard Morris, however, was a man who did not cater to assumption. "Well," Richard said, taking a measured sip of his whiskey, "we made sure that the financial responsibilities were split fairly. This was, after all, a union of equals." The words were smooth, deliberate, and they landed like a hammer against glass. Jessica did not have to look at Lucas to know he was fuming. She could feel it radiating off of him, the quiet fury beneath his carefully composed exterior. For months, he had been operating under the belief that marriage to her would grant him unrestricted access to the Morris wealth, that whatever financial struggles his family faced would be swiftly alleviated by his new position. This was not the first time Jessica had sensed this entitlement in him. There had been small signs along the way, subtle comments about how well off she was, jokes that weren't really jokes about how lucky he was to have found a wife who would never have to worry about a thing. And then, more recently, the offhanded remarks about her work, about how, with the kind of money she had, she didn't need to dedicate so much time to her career. He had assumed that, as his wife, she would exist as an extension of his ambitions, that her wealth was simply an unspoken dowry, something to be merged seamlessly into his own assets. Now, with the reality sinking in that the Morris family did not hand out blank checks, even to their own blood, Jessica knew he was seething. He recovered quickly, of course. He said smoothly, his lips curling into a facsimile of a smile. "A partnership. That was always the intention." But she heard it, the sharp edge beneath his words. He was furious. The rest of the table had moved on, but Jessica remained hyper-aware of the man sitting beside her, of the way he clenched and unclenched his jaw, his fingers drumming absently against the pristine white tablecloth. For the first time that evening, she felt something close to satisfaction. After the dinner portion of the reception concluded, the guests were encouraged to move freely throughout the estate, enjoying the various entertainment sections set up for the evening. Some gathered by the open bar, others ventured out onto the grand balcony where a second orchestra played beneath the starlit sky. Jessica made her way toward the gardens, needing space to think. She had barely stepped onto the stone pathway when she heard footsteps behind her. Lucas. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. He fell into step beside her, silent for a few moments, his hands tucked into his pockets. Then, quietly, but with the unmistakable undertone of restrained anger, he said, "I didn't realize your family was so calculating." Jessica inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. Splitting costs fairly, a union of equals. He let out a short, humorless laugh. That's an interesting way of putting it. She knew what he meant. He wasn't angry at the money itself. He was angry at what it symbolized. By refusing to bankroll the wedding entirely, her family had made a statement. They were not handing him a key to the vault. Jessica turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. His usual mask of charm was gone, replaced by something colder. He had spent his life believing he was superior to people like her, and yet here he was, dependent on her. She saw the humiliation in his eyes, and she knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was not a partnership. This was a war, a quiet war, waged through sharp words and veiled threats. And the first battle had just been won. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Lucas returned to his performance, laughing with guests, making himself the center of attention once again. But Jessica saw through it now. She saw the cracks, the resentment simmering beneath his skin. She should have felt uneasy, but instead she felt something else. Power. Because for the first time since this engagement had been arranged, she was the one with the upper hand. Lucas had believed he was marrying into wealth, but he had underestimated her. And tonight, he had realized his mistake. The energy in the Randolph estate shifted as the evening stretched into its final hours. The once pristine facade of a perfect wedding was beginning to crack, revealing the unspoken tensions that had simmered beneath the surface all night. The laughter was louder now. Some guests had indulged too much in the never-ending flow of champagne, while others remained composed, still caught in the spectacle of one of the most anticipated unions of the year. But Jessica felt it. The growing resentment, the quiet storm brewing just beneath Lucas's carefully constructed mask. She had seen the way his expression hardened whenever someone brought up her success rather than his, the way his grip had tightened around his glass when his financial situation had been subtly called into question. He was unraveling. Jessica remained composed, watching, waiting. She had spent years learning how to read people, how to anticipate their moves before they even knew they would make them. And right now, she knew exactly what Lucas was thinking. He had lost control once tonight when he realized that her family had not given him a blank check, and he would not allow himself to feel powerless again. She could see it in the way he carried himself now, his movements slightly tenser, his smile just a fraction too forced. He needed to regain control, to reestablish his dominance in a way that reminded her, and everyone else, that he was still the one in charge. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The grand wedding cake, a towering masterpiece of white and gold, was wheeled out onto the center of the ballroom. It was the final act of the evening, the tradition where the bride and groom would share their first bite of cake, a symbolic gesture of unity and partnership. Jessica walked toward the cake, her gown gliding effortlessly behind her, the eyes of hundreds of guests following her every move. Lucas was already there, waiting for her with a perfectly curated smile on his face. The cameras were trained on them, their every move immortalized in photographs and videos that would circulate among high society for years to come. A silver knife was placed in her hand, and Lucas reached for it as well, their fingers brushing against each other as they cut into the first layer together, the motion smooth, precise, rehearsed. The applause was polite, the flashes of cameras bright. Then came the part that everyone was anticipating, the moment where they would feed each other the first bite. Jessica carefully lifted a small piece, balancing it on her fork before offering it to Lucas. He accepted it with a slight smirk, chewing slowly as he held her gaze. Then it was his turn. Jessica knew what was coming before it happened. She saw the way his hand gripped the cake just a little too tightly, the slight shift in his posture, the way his expression darkened for just a fraction of a second before he executed his move. With a swift, deliberate motion, Lucas lifted a large piece of cake and shoved it directly into her face. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. A thick layer of sugary frosting smeared across her cheek, her lips, her eyelashes, the cream coating her skin as it dripped onto the delicate lace of her gown. The weight of the room shifted in an instant. A few guests let out nervous laughs, unsure of whether this was meant to be playful, waiting to gauge Jessica's reaction before deciding how to respond. Others simply stared in stunned silence, recognizing that this was not a light-hearted joke, but something else entirely. Jessica didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into the air. Lucas had expected laughter. He had expected that people would brush it off, that she would smile, wipe the frosting away, and continue playing her part. That she would let him have this, let him assert his dominance in this one small, humiliating way. But Jessica Morris was not a woman who tolerated being made a fool of. The whispers began almost immediately. Did that just happen? He just threw that cake right in her face. That wasn't playful. That was... The sound of someone hastily setting down their glass punctuated the murmurs. Out of the corner of her eye, Jessica saw her father stand up. Richard Morris's expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet fury in the way he carried himself. Evelyn Morris remained seated, but she reached out, placing a hand on her husband's arm, stopping him before he could take a step forward. Not yet. Not here. Jessica inhaled slowly. She reached for the napkin that had been left on the table beside her. She wiped the frosting from her cheek in a slow, deliberate motion, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged. Then she met Lucas's gaze, and for the first time that night, she saw something new in his eyes. Doubt, uncertainty, a flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong move. She let the silence stretch just a moment longer, ensuring that everyone in the room felt it. Then, with quiet, devastating clarity, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception did not recover. Not really. People tried to pretend, of course. The band resumed playing, the waitstaff continued serving, the guests attempted to shift their focus back to their drinks and their conversations. But the energy had changed. The illusion had cracked. Jessica did not return to the ballroom. Instead, she retreated to the private bridal suite upstairs, where she peeled the soiled fabric of her wedding gown away from her body, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. A woman covered in the remnants of what should have been a celebration. A woman who had allowed herself to believe, for a time, that she could navigate this marriage on her own terms. She should have known better. There was no salvaging this. She had given Lucas every opportunity to prove that there was something in him worth trusting, and he had just proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was not. A knock sounded at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. Her mother entered first, followed closely by her father. Evelyn's expression was unreadable, though Jessica could see the sharpness in her eyes, the kind of sharpness that only emerged when something truly unforgivable had occurred. Richard, however, looked ready to tear through walls. "You don't have to make any decisions tonight," Evelyn said carefully. But Jessica already had. She met her mother's gaze through the mirror. "This is over." And for the first time that evening, she felt something close to relief, because she had been waiting for a reason. And now she had one, the final, undeniable confirmation that she would never, could never, spend her life with a man like Lucas Randolph. She had once believed that she could bend the terms of this marriage to suit her, that she could outmaneuver him, control the pieces in a way that ensured her own power. But power meant nothing if she allowed herself to be degraded. And Jessica Morris did not belong to anyone. By the time the night was over, Lucas would know that, and by the time the world woke up tomorrow, they would all know it too. Jessica stood in the dimly lit bridal suite, her gown in ruins, the remnants of cake still clinging to the delicate lace. The weight of the evening settled over her, but instead of sorrow, she felt something sharp and cold. Clarity. She had spent months convincing herself that she could control this marriage, that she could outmaneuver Lucas, shape the terms to her advantage. But tonight had shown her exactly what kind of man she had married. Not a partner. Not an equal. A man desperate to reassert his power in the only way he knew how, through humiliation. Her mother stood nearby, composed as ever, though Jessica could see the fire simmering beneath her carefully crafted mask. Evelyn Morris had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of restraint, but even she was shaken. Her father, Richard Morris, was less reserved. He paced near the door, his fists clenched, his entire posture radiating barely contained fury. "I should go downstairs and—" "No." Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Not here. Not now." Jessica turned to her father. "It's done." Richard met her gaze, searching for hesitation, but he found none. He nodded once, his decision made as swiftly as hers. "Then we end it." A sharp knock interrupted them. Malcolm. Her brother stepped inside, his expression dark. "He's coming up here." Jessica exhaled slowly. Of course, Lucas was coming. This was what men like him did. They pushed, they tested, they demanded explanations when things didn't go their way. But Lucas had already lost, and he didn't even know it yet. "Let him in," she said, her voice steady. Malcolm hesitated, his jaw tightening, but eventually he nodded, stepping aside as the door swung open. Lucas entered, his polished shoes sinking into the plush carpet, the scent of whiskey and arrogance clinging to him. He took in the room, his gaze sweeping over Jessica's ruined gown, the silent fury in her parents' eyes, the presence of Malcolm, a quiet reminder that he was outnumbered. For the first time that night, he seemed uncertain. "I came to talk," he said, his voice smooth but lacking the confidence it usually carried. Jessica didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched him, letting the silence stretch. Lucas cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Are you really going to do this?" His voice was lower now, almost a whisper. "Walk away from this marriage over a joke?" Still, Jessica said nothing. His jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous, Jessica. It was just cake." "No one laughed," she finally said, her voice quiet but razor sharp. He let out a scoff, running a hand through his hair. "So that's it? You're going to humiliate me in front of everyone? Turn this into some kind of spectacle over nothing?" Jessica tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You already did that yourself." His nostrils flared, his composure slipping further. "This is marriage, Jessica. People don't just get to walk away when things get uncomfortable. A slow, knowing smile curved her lips. I already have. Silence filled the room. For the first time in his life, Lucas Randolph had lost control, and he knew it. He lingered for a moment longer, waiting for someone to tell him this wasn't real, that she was bluffing. But no one did, because everyone in that room knew the truth. Jessica Morris was done. Lucas exhaled sharply, then turned on his heel and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Jessica stood there, unmoving, until the silence swallowed the space he had occupied just moments before. Her mother was the first to move, stepping toward her with the same effortless grace she had carried her entire life. "We'll take care of everything." Jessica nodded, feeling the last remnants of tension drain from her shoulders. "I want it done by morning." Evelyn's lips twitched slightly, approval flashing in her eyes. "Of course." Malcolm let out a soft laugh from where he leaned against the wall. "Lucas is going to wake up tomorrow and realize his entire life fell apart while he was sleeping." Jessica met her brother's gaze. "That's the least he deserves." She turned toward the mirror, her reflection fractured but unbroken. She had entered this marriage believing she could play by the rules, believing she could shape the narrative. But power meant nothing if she allowed herself to be diminished. She stepped away from the mirror and turned to her father. "Make the calls." Richard nodded. "It's already being handled." Jessica knew what that meant. Her father had not been waiting for her to make a decision. He had already put things in motion the moment she walked away from the cake table. The moment she had made it clear that this marriage would not continue. Evelyn had always been the face of their family, but Richard had been the force behind it. By the time Lucas even realized what was happening, it would be too late. She moved toward the wardrobe, pulling open the doors. Inside hung the outfits she had brought for the honeymoon that would never happen. Without hesitation, she peeled off the ruined gown, letting it fall to the floor in a heap of wasted silk and lace. She dressed quickly, each movement precise, methodical. Her mother watched her without comment, though Jessica could feel the approval radiating from her. When she was finished, she turned back to them. "I want to be gone before he realizes." Her father checked his watch. "We have an hour, maybe less." That was enough. She didn't need to see the aftermath. She didn't need to watch as Lucas realized that the world he had so carefully constructed for himself had collapsed overnight. By the time he opened his eyes in the morning, the news would already be circulating. The engagement was broken. The marriage was annulled before it had even begun. His business connections, the ones that had already begun to waver, would pull away completely. His name, which had once carried weight, would now be attached to the image of a man who had lost everything in a single night. There would be no recovery from this. Jessica had no doubt that Lucas would try. He would fight, he would rage, he would attempt to regain control in whatever way he could. But it wouldn't matter, because he had underestimated her. And that was a mistake no one survived twice. She moved towards the door, her mother and brother following closely behind. Richard was already on the phone, his voice low and even as he finalized the details. Jessica didn't look back. She had nothing left to see. As they stepped into the elevator, Evelyn finally spoke again. "Where do you want to go?" Jessica considered the question for only a moment before exhaling. "Anywhere but here." Her mother nodded. "Then that's where we'll go." As the elevator doors closed, Jessica felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Jessica sat in the back of the black luxury car as it pulled away from the Randolph estate, the grand mansion growing smaller in the distance. The night sky stretched above her, vast and endless, a stark contrast to the suffocating walls of expectation she had lived within for months. The weight on her chest that had felt unbearable only hours ago was now lifting, replaced by something she had almost forgotten. Control. Her mother sat beside her, her posture impeccable even after the chaos of the evening. Evelyn Morris had not spoken much since they left, her mind undoubtedly working through the next steps, calculating every move that needed to be made. Across from them, her father remained on the phone, his voice calm and deliberate, issuing orders that would ensure the Randolph name crumbled by morning. Jessica knew there would be no traces of hesitation in his decisions. This was business, and in business, weakness was not tolerated. Malcolm sat next to their father, his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "By the time Lucas wakes up, he won't have a single thing left in his name," he muttered, shaking his head. "I almost wish I could see his face when he realizes." Jessica exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She didn't need to see it. She already knew how the morning would unfold. The headlines would circulate before sunrise. Reports would flood the business and social columns, dissecting every detail of what had gone wrong at the wedding of the year. The carefully crafted image of a power couple shattered in one night. The speculation would be endless. Theories ranging from a personal betrayal to business disputes, but none of it would matter, because Jessica's silence would be the loudest statement of all. Lucas would try to fight it. He would reach out to her, attempt to salvage whatever shred of dignity he had left. He would demand explanations, demand control. But Jessica had seen the truth tonight. He wasn't just a man who had expected to own her. He was a man who believed he was untouchable. And she had made sure that he understood exactly how wrong he had been. Her father ended his call and turned to her. "It's done." Jessica nodded, opening her eyes, feeling no regret. "Good." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice as smooth as ever. "There will be questions." Jessica met her mother's gaze. "Let them ask." Evelyn studied her for a long moment before nodding approvingly. "You've handled this well." Jessica glanced out the window, watching the darkened city pass by. "I learned from the best." Silence settled in the car again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not one of tension or uncertainty, but of understanding. The Randolphs had spent years maintaining an illusion of power, believing that their name alone was enough to sustain them. But they had underestimated the one thing that separated the Morris family from theirs. They built their power, they didn't inherit it, and they didn't tolerate weakness. As the car merged onto the highway, Jessica felt no need to look back. She had already decided there would be no more second-guessing, no more playing by someone else's rules. She had stepped into this marriage believing she could control it. She had left it knowing she didn't have to. By the time the city skyline came into view, she had already decided her next move. She wasn't just leaving Lucas Randolph. She was making sure no one like him ever had power over her again. And just like that, everything changed. What was meant to be a perfect union became the ultimate betrayal. Some mistakes can't be undone, and some people refuse to be broken. But in the end, one truth remains. Power belongs to those who know how to wield it. What do you think about this story? Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you never miss another gripping tale. See you next time.